Shanghai GDG is a very interesting developer community.
I'm glad somebody has asked this question.
This is where the magic happens.
This is primarily a question and answer show. So if any of you out there would like to ask questions,
Shanghai.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to our session on Content API for Shopping Office Hour. I am Amanda Surya. I'm a Developer Relations Manager for Google Commerce Products.
And I'm Danny Hermes, as you all may already know, Developer Programs Engineer on Google Shopping. So thanks for joining us today. Amanda's got some questions that we're going to be going over, covering some things that people have been asking on the forum, and also some recent developments in Google Shopping as we go forward. And if people have questions who are viewing this remotely, please feel free to add them to our moderator queue. So.
All right, so there's this question in our forum recently about the benefits of switching from existing data feed infrastructure to using the Content API for Shopping. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so first I want to say we did a video last October, and I mentioned this in the forum as well, and you can see the screen share of the YouTube video here that I'm sharing in the Hangout. And we compared and contrast feeds and the Content API and kind of cut out firm use cases where you might actually be more interested in the Content API. And some of them were actually expounded upon by Andrew from Zazzle in the forum, and he actually explained, what they used to do, what they do now, what some of the downfalls are, and how the pros outweigh the cons. This actually speaks directly to our best practices because the best practices kind of point to why you might want to make the switch, or why maybe you might not make the switch, or why it might not be necessary for you to make the switch. So I have it pulled up here. The very first part of the best practices page lists when to use the Content API for shopping. So
when should we use it?
Yeah, exactly. So there are sort of four use cases. The first use case, obviously, is when you want to be programmatic, when you don't actually want to have human interaction, or you don't actually want to be uploading something by hand.
If you have like a lot of processing.
Right, or maybe you just have an automated system and you want it to stay automated, right? Obviously, there are ways to do this already with feeds files, but it requires manually creating spreadsheets or comma separated value sheets or some other column formatted feed, and then using FTP to programmatically upload it. And then of course there are all these other issues, right? Another nice to have feature, which we certainly emphasized in that video and we emphasize here as well, is the fact that you get immediate feedback back from the API rather than when you're using feeds. Feedback is asynchronous and comes in an email summary, whereas feedback from the API is immediate, on the order of half a second, and it is for every single item in your particular request that's being given feedback. Okay, and one of the main things that Andrew emphasized, and that a lot of people making the switch, the original poster was asking. They said they had 1.5 million products, right? Well, if you're sending feeds, and even if you're sending them once an hour, and your feeds are getting processed in that hour, right? It's still an hour out of date for some of the products that were updated at the very beginning, right? So what they said at Zazzle was they actually had some merchants who were upset by the infrequency of these updates, and by using the Content API, they're actually able to get these updates in almost immediately, rather than waiting for the feed to get processed and then the data to get pushed back through. And a final use case, which I'll also touch on briefly, was if you have multiple sub-accounts, and going to the Merchant Center and clicking through all these sub-accounts is infeasible. So even if you had multiple people working on it, once you exceed probably 10, 20 sub-accounts, it's not really very possible for human beings to go in and make sure particular changes are actually as desired by the client or the end user that you're actually managing product data for. right? The second part of this document is actually the best practices themselves, how to actually go ahead and use the Content API. And the very first one says don't use the API as you would use feeds. So obviously this is sort of like, you know, if you're on our side of the fence, don't straddle the fence type of recommendation. But it's actually it actually shines some light on why you might want to make the switch. In the feeds world, like I previously mentioned, you have to send your entire feed. So you have to send the things that don't change at all. You have to send all the new things. You have to send the updates, and you have to make sure the things you're deleting aren't in there, right? Well, with the Content API, you don't have to do that. So all you have to do with the Content API is send the changes, right? And that's about all I'm going to say about best practices. But the fourth bullet point in how to use the Content API for shopping is a caveat that Andrew noted in his response, which is actually a pretty important caveat. So by default, products, whether they're inserted via feeds or via the Content API, they can't expire in more than 30 days. So the longest expiration you can have for a product that you insert or update is 30 days. And so if you're using the Content API, you're not actually sending updates for products that don't change. Well, if for some reason part of your inventory hasn't changed in 30 days, on day 31, if you don't send any updates, that product will disappear and eventually be garbage collected and actually be out of your inventory rather than showing as expired in your inventory. So it's actually important when you make the switch to change this frame of mind from I need to send all my product data all the time to I need to send my updates whenever they happen, and I also need to make sure that my infrequently updating products don't get obsoleted via an expiration date, right? So it was a great question, and the poster also had another question, which we're actually gonna jump right to.
Right. So let's switch gear a little bit. There is another question, different question about our Java sample code.
Right.
And you know, what do we currently have? What do we currently provide for a developer who's using Java and wants to use the content shopping? And you know, what's our plan forward?
Sure.
In terms of resources.
So people who look at our developer resources in our documentation will notice that there's a Java developer's guide, a .NET developer's guide, a Python developer's guide, and a PHP developer's guide. And people who know all four languages might look at the Java developer's guide and think we don't like Java developers. But that's not the case. We're a small team. It's something we're aware of that is a bit lagging behind the other three. But our sample is certainly a workable starting point for actual working Java code. So the PHP library is sort of a special case. We manage our own small PHP library just for shopping. But for .NET and Python, there are large GData libraries. So Python is gdata-python-client, and for .NET it's Google-gdata. .NET must have gotten there first for grabbing that name, right? But for Java, we don't really have any equivalent library that we recommend for merchants. However, one exists. Just like there's a gdata-python-client, there's a gdata-java-client. And for actual GData APIs, other than the Content API for shopping that are implemented there, the way the way the code is implemented, for example, the way the HTTP requests are formed and sent, it uses an external library called that obviously works with HTTP. Similarly, for doing authentication, like client login, OAuth, auth OAuth 1.0 or 2.0, that is, it uses a jar coming from a different Google client library, and this is something that the original poster, Rich, actually asked about. So first, I want to say that all these dependencies in the sample are actually consistent with what the GData Java client requires. But the fact that we have sort of handful data classes is just a symptom of us being a bit behind. So we certainly are working right now actively on getting support into the library and actually updating the section in the developer's guide about Java. A few things, a few more things that I want to say about this. So first of all, the original poster asked about the difference between sort of this GData library and these new libraries, and he quoted some statement in the Google-API Java-client library about how Google is updating to discovery-based APIs. So I actually talk a bit about all of this in a video that I recorded. We actually have a playlist of all of our videos for Content API developers, and you should see that flashing across your screen. The specific video where I talk about Auth and OAuth 2 and some of these other mechanisms is called Getting Started with Google Shopping, and there should be a short link to the YouTube video flashing across your screen for that as well. I actually go through the auth flow in Python around the 18-minute mark. It takes about 22 minutes.
Right.
The difference between GData APIs and these other APIs is just sort of the newer Google APIs are exactly that. They're newer. So GData uses sort of an older framework, right? And we certainly don't have any estimations on a timeline or anything like that. But for the time being, the Content API is a GData library. So that is the target for developers. You shouldn't be targeting this new library that exists, but it's not actually intended for GData APIs. So you should actually be targeting what's in the sample. And finally, the last question about why OAuth, why not client login, why not some of these other ones? So there are a few things to say about that, but most importantly, we announced on April 20th, as you may be able to see in the screen I'm sharing, that along with some other older Google APIs, the actual Auth APIs, other than OAuth 2, are being deprecated. So client login, Auth sub, and OAuth 1.0 are all being deprecated, and I believe April 20th, 2015 is when they're officially retired. But between now and then, they are to be considered deprecated, and I would highly recommend against developing with them in mind. Rather, develop with OAuth 2 in mind. And this is something we certainly get plenty of questions about, and we're happy to go more in depth about if people still aren't understanding things.
Yeah, and definitely feel free to post your additional questions around OAuth 2 in the forum as well.
Yeah.
You have concerns about that. All right. So another questions that we recently got is about destination.
Yep.
So in the spec, there's 3 supported destination values: product search, product ads, commerce search. Can you talk more about that? There are other valid values
right.
as well. What are those, and how can people use it?
Right. So this question from Thor, love the name, was a good question. So he was asking, I'm seeing some other values like shopping API and affiliate network, and I'm wondering why these aren't in the documentation. So these attributes are not valid for every account. So that's kind of why we don't include them in our documentation. So some people who also have used the search API for shopping may be familiar with the Google Affiliate Network. And so product data you can actually make valid for the destination Google Affiliate Network if you're actually in the Google Affiliate Network. And by the same token, if you elect, your product data can also be consumed by all users of the shopping API. The search API for shopping. And that's why the shopping API destination is a possible value as well. But for the time being, products ads, product search, and commerce search are these valid destinations. So a bit more about how to use destinations. So Thor was having some issues where he was getting errors that he didn't really understand why. So if no destinations are sent, then by default we say you have to require at least one destination is valid for your product data. And so the default value for a required destination is product search. And the way required destinations work is if your product doesn't validate for that destination, then your response will be rejected and you'll get a failure. So your product data will never get uploaded or inserted, whatever term you're looking to use. But whatever it is, it won't end up in the database corresponding to your Merchant Center account, right? So what Thor was doing was he was asking for validate destination for product search with nothing else. So this default value of required for product search was also being inserted. So the API doesn't allow you to validate and require the same destination. So that's why his requests were getting rejected. And for those who aren't familiar, what it means to validate rather than required. So I mentioned this term validate when I was talking about required. So are they the same? Are they different? Well, required will go ahead and validate that destination, and if it fails validation, it will reject the request. On the other hand, validate destination will go ahead and it'll validate the destination in question, but rather than rejecting the request, if the actual product data is valid for some other destination, it won't get inserted for the destination that you asked to be validated, but you will get the errors back for why it wasn't valid. So it's a way for people who maybe aren't as strict about a particular destination, maybe shopping API, for example, but it allows for them to actually attempt to get the data put in there and then find out why, for some reason, the given product or set of products weren't valid. And then, of course, there's this third value, which Thor didn't ask about, but excluded destination, and that's exactly what it sounds like. You don't want your product data surfacing in that destination, and it just won't be validated, it won't be inserted. And then there was sort of a third question that Thor had, and that was, given the move from Google Product Search to Google Shopping, what's going to happen with product ads and product search, and where are we going with that? So that's something I want people to know that we're thinking about, but we don't have anything to say at this time, but it's certainly something that we're aware of. Okay? And I'm going to...
Speaking of that, there's actually a series of webinars that are Google Shopping product marketing managers and partnership teams put together. And if you're wondering about what it means, how to turn on product listing ads on your product listings, these series of webinars, we highly recommend you to review them. It's a great resource to get started with that, and also paints the bigger picture in terms of where Google Shopping is moving forward. Yep. And you can view the series in the YouTube channel, or you can follow John Vanverlo, who is in the partnership team, and he basically on his G+ page lists all the series of webinars that he and his team has done, and it's a great resource again for some of you who wants to get a better understanding of the overall picture and intro materials to Google Shopping.
Yep. And we'll be posting some links in that YouTube video after the fact. So if you're actually watching the YouTube video after the fact, the link should be in the description. Right. We'll link to John's page and the specific posts that he has linked, as well as to the channel where you can find some of these videos.
All right, so those are pretty much the questions that we've seen in the forum, and there are no questions in the Google moderator. Okay. So I think we're off the hook here.
Alrighty.
And for those of you listening in, thank you for joining us. And if you want to learn more about the Content API for shopping, as well as our other commerce APIs, visit developers.google.com/commerce, and all the information and documentation should be there. And we're doing this bi-weekly, so hope to see you in 2 weeks.
How many days are in August? 30 or 31?
31.
I think there's 31. So September 13th
yes.
is 14 days from now. Alrighty. Thanks everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you.